Welcome. My name is John Horning, and I am the Executive Director of WildEarth Guardians. I want to thank you all for joining us for today's webinar. These are challenging times, and now more than ever, it's a delight to bring together Guardians community, given that we're all dealing with the challenges of the isolation that this global pandemic has imposed upon us, and the challenges of living at a time and with federal leaders who divide us instead of unify us. So I'm grateful that we have these opportunities to come together, because I think it reminds us of our unifying humanity. We have Guardian supporters from all over the country, which I love, taking part in this webinar, from California to New Jersey, and a bunch of states in between, and many of the states in the American West. I want to offer a special welcome, as I have done the last few times, to two long-standing members. We have Craig Peterson of Golden, Colorado, and Susan Selbin of Albuquerque, New Mexico, who's been a member of WildEarth Guardians for more than a decade. So welcome, a special welcome to both of you. In these webinars, we bring together national issue experts, people from frontline communities, elected officials, and of course, WildEarth Guardian staff, to talk about critical issues at a critical time. In case anyone needs a reminder, this is a critical time. We are 12 days away from the most important election in our lives. Our purpose is to inform, to inspire, and to activate Guardians like you to help us confront powerful extractive industries and demand greater leadership from our elected officials to solve the nature and climate crises and create the kind of world we want. Today, we'll be talking about the Trump administration's dismantling of the Clean Water Act and the ways in which those rollbacks are harming Western rivers. We'll focus part of our discussion on a variety of Western rivers, while also talking about the national context, of course. And we'll be talking a little bit about the Rio Grande, which is the watershed in which I live. So just want to note that. And all of it is framed in the context of the importance of the Clean Water Act and the challenge of protecting living rivers. With me today to discuss these matters are Kelly Hunter Foster, who is the senior attorney with the Waterkeeper Alliance, and Jen Pelz, Waterkeeper for the Rio Grande River, and of course, Wild Rivers Program Director for WildEarth Guardians. Welcome to each of you. It's good to have you.
Thanks, John. It's fun to be here.
Yeah. So I want to start by asking each of you to briefly introduce yourselves and share why rivers matter to you. Why don't you go first, Kelly?
Okay, so I think, so I'm a senior attorney at Waterkeeper Alliance. I work on our Clean Water Defense campaign and our Pure Farms, Pure Waters campaign. The Pure Farms, Pure Waters campaign being focused on CAFO pollution, and the Clean Water Defense campaign in particular has been very active in the current administration because of all of the rollbacks. And that's been a real focus of our campaign this year, or in the past 4 years, really, is trying to push back against this effort. Why I love rivers, I think it's the hardest question. I do deeply love rivers. I grew up in Southwest Missouri, surrounded by beautiful crystal clear Ozark streams, some of the prettiest streams in the world to me. But I've grown through my career and working with people to appreciate all of the other aspects of rivers, from drinking water to the spiritual aspects of rivers for people. And frankly, I just admire the power of rivers and the importance that they bring to communities that live around them.
Beautiful. Thank you, Kelly. Jen?
Hi, I'm Jen Pelz. Welcome. I am the Wild Rivers Program Director here at Guardians and also the Rio Grande Waterkeeper. I grew up in the Rio Grande Basin in Albuquerque and Santa Fe, and spent a lot of time in southern Colorado on the Conejos River. And so rivers have a really special place in my heart from when I was a child. And the memories that I have that are the most like just vibrant in my life are those around rivers with my dad, with my two children. And so I feel super lucky that not only do I get to experience rivers on a regular basis, but I also get to work in my job to protect them. So I feel really privileged to be able to have that both work and life centered around rivers.
Lovely.
How about you, John? I would love to know your connection to rivers.
Well, everyone at Guardians knows that I say this somewhat jokingly, but I was a beaver in a past life. So given that, I just was born in water and I need water. But probably like most of us who love rivers more seriously, there's a part of your childhood that connects with rivers. And so being next to them, being a part of them, being in them, floating on them, just makes you feel like you're at home. So let's talk about, now that we're grounded in our love for rivers, why, let's talk first, Kelly, just about the environmental safety net and what it is and why the safety net of environmental laws is important and what has happened under the Trump administration over the last 4 years. Kelly's going to provide a few slides for us to help really ground us.
This is more about one particular example of a rollback that I want to cover in some detail. But just as sort of an overview, we almost immediately in 2017, the end of 2017, recognized that we were about to see the dismantling of our federal environmental laws, which are sometimes portrayed as just being about environmental protection or protection of waters or air, but it's really more than that. It is about protecting wildlife, human health, water quality, air quality. They protect so many aspects of our lives that in ways that I think we don't always appreciate because we've had them in place since the 70s, largely unchanged. And we have a lot of benefits that we have because of that. And so late 2017, early January, we started getting a sense of just how dramatic this effort was going to be in all of the agencies to start rolling back these protections in a way that is not consistent with the mission of the federal environmental laws or the statutes themselves in many instances. The agencies have discretion, but they don't have so much discretion that they've been trying to exercise to completely gut these laws. All of it started in February with this sort of fire hose onslaught of executive orders from President Trump, directing the agencies to do things that affect the integrity of the regulatory systems under the federal laws themselves. Things like, if you want a new regulation, you have to get rid of 2 other regulations without regard to, what kind of impact that would have. 2 things like rolling back, and it was one of the most earliest things that he did, was to roll back the Clean Water Act protections by narrowly defining which waters can be protected. And I will cover that in a little bit of detail. Those executive orders from affecting everything, from NEPA, the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, has led the agencies to take nearly 100 or slightly more deregulatory actions that are right now in court. A lot of them, some of them have already been overturned. And some of them are still in process, but they're coming out kind of quickly this year. So we're getting a lot of new ones.
Yeah, discretion under the Trump administration has meant dismantling, and that's not what federal law gives them the authority to do, is essentially what I hear you saying. Just one thought before maybe you or Jen respond to that. Got a comment in the chat box that reminded me that I want to encourage all of the participants to ask questions. I'll take one or two questions halfway through, and then we'll take as many questions as we can handle in the final 10 minutes of this webinar. So please put your questions out there. And there was a request to see if we can make the table bigger. I don't think we can, but if you can, great. And if not, let's just have people focus on that section of the table that you want their gaze to really focus on. And maybe I could ask a second question, which is, you're a Clean Water Act expert, obviously a lover of rivers. What specifically has the Trump administration done that has fundamentally kind of reoriented and weakened the nature of the Clean Water Act and the protections that it provides for rivers, especially in the West, although maybe we'll get to that last part in another few minutes. So what have they done just to dismantle the act?
A bunch of different things. The most fundamental thing that they've done is this effort to redefine what is a water of the United States. If a water body is not, and maybe I'm going to say this, if you can zoom in on here, you can also make your screen full screen, and depending on what kind of monitor you have, the table gets rather large. Then we could probably also share this at some point if people want to look at it more, because it is a lot of information. So the heart of the Clean Water Act is this definition of waters of the United States. And from the mid-1970s to 2015, we had this definition that broadly protected the nation's waters. And it was premised on this idea that Congress has the ability to regulate impacts on interstate and foreign commerce. And that's a really important concept within the Clean Water Act. And Congress made it clear that was what they wanted to do. So the agencies had this very broad definition that protected most every kind of surface water in the United States. In 2015, we got a switch from that in the Obama administration, with a shift towards limiting it to waters only to the extent they had the right kind of nexus to traditionally navigable waters, territorial seas, and interstate waters. And so that was the first step in removing protections for particular kinds of waters. And that you started to see those types of potential impacts in the West primarily, where you have different kinds of ways that water bodies connect there and different kinds of flow regimes. And so that got challenged in court, and there's a whole saga that goes along with that. And then with the Trump administration definition, you just get a gutting, not only of the legal basis that underlies why we protect waters, but also a narrowing in a way that makes it impossible for us to achieve the goals of the Clean Water Act, which are to restore the physical, chemical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. So if you aren't protecting all of the feeder waters that come into, the increasingly larger bodies of water, you can't protect the downstream waters. And Congress knew that. We've known that for a long time. With this rule, there's a narrowing of a focus of protecting only commercially, we think. The rule is vague, to say the least, but commercially navigable waters and the territorial seas, and only a subset of the waters that feed into them, using these strange and non-scientific sort of arbitrary categories for all these different kinds of waters. And this table is an attempt to give you a sense of that shift over time. The rule itself is very complicated, and I can't represent it in anything that's small. But just a couple of things to point out. There's a complete elimination of protections for interstate waters and the complete elimination of the significant nexus test, as well as the very important part of the 1970s definition where we could protect intrastate waters, waters within state boundaries, where destruction or pollution of that water could have an impact on interstate or foreign commerce. So those have both been eliminated, and all ephemeral streams have been eliminated, which really affects the West. And even limits have been placed on regulation of perennial and intermittent streams, both in terms of limiting it because it flows into, limiting it to only rivers that flow to commercially navigable waters, but also by establishing these non-scientific definitions of perennial and intermittent flow and the requirement that that flow be present in a typical year. No one knows what those words mean exactly in this context. So
Yeah.
that's kind of my overview.
Yeah, you know, we didn't talk about this beforehand, but I'm struck in this moment. Why? I mean, we know that the Trump administration has done this. You mentioned 100 different environmental laws or regulatory rollbacks. Either for you, Jen, or Kelly, like, give us a quick sense of why. Who's the beneficiary of this dismantling through narrowing the definition of what waters are protected under the Clean Water Act?
Well, it's a gift to industry. I mean, the folks who are either discharging into streams or developing in or around streams under the Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, dredging and filling, like, these are industries. These are the oil and gas industry benefits from this. Development interest benefit from this. It's a gift to industry. I mean, it's been pretty clear that he's been cozy with industry, and the administration's been really friendly to industry, and this is essentially a big gift to them.
Yep. Anything to add to that, Kelly?
Well, I would say it's easy to figure out who wanted this by who advocated for it very publicly. The primary advocate for it is the Farm Bureau. And that's where the executive order was announced to the public, was at a big Farm Bureau meeting in Washington, D.C. So them and some other interest groups that advocate for industry really pushed for this.
Yep. Okay. Why, just got a request for you to speak a little louder, Kelly, from one of our participants. Let's talk more about the West. Why does this matter in the West? Why don't you take that one, Jen?
Sure. You know, the West is an arid part of the country. And so when you have a rule that affects the entire country and doesn't take into account the special and different characteristics of the West, it obviously can impact the West more. And as Kelly mentioned, one of the biggest things that this rule does is it eliminates jurisdiction over intermittent and ephemeral streams, which those are streams that don't flow year round. And so if you have states like New Mexico and Arizona and Nevada that are very arid and have a lot of ephemeral streams, then they're going to be affected more. Overall, 60% of waterways are excluded based on this rule in the United States, but the percentages in the West are much more significant. Arizona has roughly 94% of its streams are ephemeral or intermittent. New Mexico, Nevada, it's over 90%. Colorado, it's around 88%. So that's a significant portion of the waters that you're talking about. You know, the slide that was just up before is a slide of the Rio Grande Basin. And if we could go back to that slide really quick, the incredible thing is if you look at the slide on the left, that's the Rio Grande Basin prior to the Trump rule, which would the Trump administration's rule. So from 70s to 2015, you can see all of those blue streams are covered by the Clean Water Act. Under this new rule, you can see that the major rivers like the Rio Grande and a few of the tributary streams are still covered. They're the blue streams. And then everything else, all of those little red streams are all streams that are probably not, very likely not covered under this new rule. They're not. And so that means that you can discharge pollutants into those waterways without any regulation. And so if you go, this slide is a closer look. This is the Rio Grande Basin near Santa Fe. And you can see that the Rio Grande and a couple of the other tributaries, there's 2 on this that you can see that are actually covered. And then all of these other tributary ephemeral streams are not covered under the Act. And so it has really significant ramifications for drinking water quality. And if you think about in the West, if you have headwater streams and these ephemeral streams, they all come together in big rivers. And so if you can't control the water quality of those headwater streams and those tributary, those tiny little streams that all come together in the Rio Grande or the Rio Chama, the water quality is going to be in those big rivers affected by the fact that those little rivers aren't regulated anymore.
Could you go back to something I thought I heard you say about the percentage of waters that are likely not covered in a couple Western states? Did I hear 88% in Colorado?
Yeah.
88.
Well, it's actually above 70% in Colorado.
Wow. So, I mean, I knew it was bad, read a bunch of articles, you hear this, but 70% of waters in the state of Colorado are likely not now protected under this new definition and this new rule. And yeah. in New Mexico, what's the
over similar? 90%.
Over 90%. Incredible.
Yep.
Incredible. Huh.
And 94% in Arizona. So that's the majority of all of these waterways in these Western states.
Yeah, it's like all the veins feeding the arteries, and the veins don't get protected, only the main arteries under this new rule.
Exactly.
Yeah. So let's just get rid of our veins in our body. We only need to survive on the arteries in our body is the analogy that's coming to mind. We have a question in the chat box that I'd like to get to in about 5 minutes. I think it'd be good maybe to talk, and we can leave the map up as I actually had one other question about the map. This map, the dark reddish area. Could you explain what that is geographically, either one of you, and how the rule particularly sort of eviscerates those geographic areas?
Do you want to take this one, Kelly? I assume you're talking about the closed basin, or are you talking about just yeah,
you might have to help me. I don't remember the exact square miles, but it's gigantic, and it's called the Central Closed Basin, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And
yep.
So that segment of the watershed doesn't have an outlet on the surface to the rest of the watershed. And even though there are important waters within it, including some streams, which are the red part there, those lose protections completely. And that's because of that shift I told you about, with the old way of approaching it being the Commerce Clause, to this narrow conception of let's only protect certain kinds of waters that are connected via surface flow to commercially navigable waterways. When you do that, you end up creating these, major segments, not just in this watershed, but in lots of Western watersheds that are completely outside the scope of the Clean Water Act.
Yeah, I just find it incredible that a basin, just by virtue of, or a stream, just by virtue of not having an outflow to the ocean, no longer is a stream, according to this, doesn't merit protection under the Clean Water Act. And this is probably more unique to the West, where you have these closed basins, but there are plenty of beautiful, not huge, but small streams, and definitely playas that are obviously just no longer have protections, and it's just shocking. So we want to talk a little bit before we take a question or two from the participants' audience. real life examples of how this policy is playing out or how it might play out on various Western rivers? Just to give people, bring it to ground.
Absolutely. We have several examples. I'll talk about the Rio Grande because that's my home watershed and the one that I work in frequently. But one great example is Santa Fe, right? So the city of Santa Fe has the Santa Fe River that runs through its heart. It also serves traditional communities downstream, as well as it should end it would end in the Rio Grande, flowing into the Rio Grande if it had flows. It's an ephemeral or intermittent stream that doesn't flow year round. And so the Santa Fe River is not covered under the Trump administration's definition of waters of the United States. So anyone who lives in Santa Fe, that means that your drinking water potentially from that source is not protected. And then to add insult to injury, the other source of water for the city of Santa Fe is the Buckman Wells, which take water from the Rio Grande. And the Rio Grande, its location on the Rio Grande is downstream of Los Alamos National Laboratories. And anyone who has heard about the laboratories knows that it's a source of legacy pollution. They have current discharge permits into ephemeral streams that run into the Rio Grande and affect not only the city of Santa Fe's drinking water, but also every community downstream. And so just as one example, that particular rule is impacting the source of water for the city of Santa Fe. It's impacting traditional communities, agricultural communities downstream, Pueblo communities. And so it's going to have a really significant impact on the water quality and the potential for regulation of the water quality in both the Rio Grande and the Santa Fe River.
So is it feasible to think, Jen, that the labs, our national labs, could argue reasonably that they need not even get a permit to discharge by virtue of this rule?
Yeah. I mean, they have permits, but yeah, they would have an argument.
Yeah, that's crazy to think. Do we want to go to maybe one other example in another Western river before we take a question or two from the audience?
Yeah, and I'll just say, I didn't even really reference the slide, but the past slide shows you where the legacy pollution in Los Alamos is, which is in the top left-hand corner. And you can see all those little triangles are discharges, current existing discharges into tributary streams. And then all the other pink dots on the lower right-hand corner of that are all in the Santa Fe watershed. So you can see that it's not like there's just one discharge that we're talking about. We're talking about many, many discharges in both of those locations. And then the one on the right, just for your reference, is Albuquerque, and it shows all the different places in which discharges occur and how close they are to the Rio Grande, and how those canals and areas in which discharges are occurring are not covered under the new rule. So
yeah. Yeah, shocking. So Kelly, before you go to we can go to the next slide, but I have to ask this. I saw WOTUS. What does that mean? And I just have to say this. Is it true that the POTUS has undone the WOTUS?
It's true.
What is the WOTUS? What is the WOTUS for the audience?
Well, people, it's Waters of the United States. It's
so
short.
It's an acronym. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So back to serious matters. The POTUS has undone the WOTUS, but which river are we looking at now? And tell us more about the impact of this rule on this river.
So I did a couple of slides just to give you an overview, a sense of it, that even in, wetter watersheds like the Snake River, as compared to the Rio Grande, we still have a massive loss of streams. This map is focused just on streams and rivers. We also have a big loss over canals and ditches in the Snake. But again, we have one of those closed basins in the upper Snake River. And there are a bunch of really important streams for trout fishermen, for drinking water, for endangered species protection in the upper Snake River. And that area in red there is a big chunk that's going to be lost under this particular definition of WOTUS that is of great concern to us. And if
amazing.
you want to look at the next one, I can show you.
Yeah, let's go to the next one.
The Rogue. There's so many Ephemeral streams are really important for the Rogue River Basin, as are these canals. You can see the canals more there in orange, but there's so many ephemeral streams in the central part of the Rogue River Basin that when I try to represent it, it just gets like a big red blur. But, you know, those ephemeral streams and a lot of those, if not all of those canals and ditches, which, you know, transport water into the Rogue River, are also, you know, likely exempted under this definition. And then on this map, we also have Crater Lake. Crater Lake is
where, sort of there's Crater Lake. I see. Crater Lake is in the upper right-hand corner, I see.
Right there. I don't know how to show it.
Yeah, if you just look in the upper right-hand corner of the map, it's outside the, it looks like it's on the boundary of the Rogue River watershed.
Yeah. And so it does not have a surface outlet. It does not flow into a commercially navigable water, territorial seas, at least directly. It may have some groundwater. That's sort of a debate scientifically. But so there's a great deal of concern, even though it's within a protected area. We can't really depend on the continued existence of protected areas in this administration. Really great concern about losing something like Crater Lake. And there's a lot of other examples of lakes like that too in the West.
Yeah, yeah. Amazing. This was your point, but that even in wetter places like Oregon, west of the Cascades, that just doing the eyeball test, it looks like more than a third of the watershed's waterways are stripped of protections.
It's a significant number. They're very, very important to the Rogue.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's get to a question from one of our participants. This one's from David Fiedler. And you both could take this. Maybe since you're inside the Beltway, Kelly, you could take it first. How is it that these protections that were memorialized into law by Congress can be completely eliminated by executive or departmental action?
Jen, do you want me to take it?
Sure.
They're not supposed to be able to be. That's why we have hope that courts are overturning actions like this. Agency regulations are required by law to be consistent with the legislation that they're implementing. Agencies don't have discretion to adopt different policies or ignore statutory directives. Their regulations are supposed to be required to be designed to achieve the goals of a piece of legislation. And so a lot of these rules, if not all of these rules, are being challenged in court because of that.
Anything to add, Jen?
No, I mean, it's true. I think Kelly said it best.
Good. Well, let's hope we have good, compassionate, science-based judges who are in whose hands this matter is before. Another question that maybe ties from a panel participant, audience member, that ties to maybe our next question, but I'll go to this question from Cabell Westbrook. Might be getting ahead of the discussion, but what is your plan moving forward under a Biden administration? Hopefully, reversals of Trump actions, question marks. How? Under a Trump administration, question mark. So what are, there's sort of some scenario planning in that question. So thoughts, Jen or Kelly?
Well, I think right now there's lots of litigation that's going on over this particular rule. And so I think that given another Trump administration, I think that litigation will be the way that this gets undone. I would say under a Biden administration, there's a little bit more room, but as Kelly showed at the very, very beginning on that first slide, you know, in 2015, under the Obama rule, there was some narrowing of the statute as well. And so while obviously it's been taken to a whole nother level under the last 4 years, I think that there would still, even under a Biden administration, I think that, we are advocating for the broadest protections of clean water. And so we will continue to do that both in the courts and working legislatively where we can. Do you have something to add, Kelly? I'm sure you do.
I mean, no, I think you covered it really well. I mean, in the event that there is a new administration, I think that there are additional things that can be done. I don't think it's going to be easy to unravel all of this. A lot of work went into doing it, and I think it's going to take a lot of work to get us out of it. But there are all of the traditional routes from, new executive orders directing the policies in the legislation to be implemented by the agencies, reversing the rules, withdrawing the rules, replacing the rules, and probably some need for legislative fixes on some of these issues as well. And so we'll just have to see, but it's going to take time.
Yeah. This is such a stark moment when a president and an administration spend so much energy and political will in dismantling not just environmental safeguards, but civil rights safeguards and other safeguards that protect the vulnerable. You can't just put the pieces back together and think that somehow we get back to the place of a pre-Trump administration. It's a tremendous amount of political will that needs to be spent, not only to rebuild the regulations, but also to kind of restore the spirit of the agencies. We haven't talked about that. Maybe we can here. But given all of this, and some of it can be quite demoralizing, what can people do to protect their communities, their water supplies, their favorite rivers? At a federal level, at a local level, at a state level? Go ahead, Jen.
I was just gonna say, I mean, I think the thing that people can do is they can speak out, and I mean, speak out in all forums. So talk to your local governments. Like if you live in the city of Santa Fe and you know what I just told you about how it's going to impact Santa Fe, talk to people in Santa Fe, talk to the city, tell them you want them to speak out, and then talk to your members of Congress, your senators, your representatives, tell them that you care about clean water, that you expect and you hope that they will stand up for it going forward, and that they will undo what this administration has done. And we have one way that you can do that. I think that in the chat, we're going to put a action alert that we created so that all you have to do is click on it, put your information in the box and send a letter. You can personalize the letter that is there for you and send it off to your representatives and tell them how important clean water is and living rivers are for you and your communities, because ultimately you're their constituents and have a lot of power.
Kelly, what would you add to I'd never obviously vote, want to underscore the importance of voting, but sometimes when you talk about what is being done to dismantle these safeguards, you can leave a conversation feeling a little dispirited, and that's the exact opposite of what we want everyone who's participating in this webinar to feel. So what would you say people can do to support the Clean Water Act, support the environmental safety net that's out there, and or to make a difference at a local level? What's your call to hope?
I think it depends a little bit on where you live. In states that have robust state environmental laws and adequate funding, I think that you can learn what there is to learn about your watersheds and some of the issues that need to be there, and talk to your state officials and ask them to do more when they need to, or do more than ask if they're not listening to you, and talk to other state officials about it. Informed people who really understand what the issues are can make a huge difference. Most people aren't talking to their state DEQ or DNR about what the issues are in their watersheds. And so that's a really important thing that people can do. You can also engage with your federal representatives, your congressmen and women, about the importance of the Clean Water Act or other laws that have been dismantled, and talk to them about how you need that to be fixed. I think in some states where you don't have, like New Mexico, where you don't really have a state program that can fill in the gap, I think that the most important thing you can do is advocate for the state to adopt statutes and regulations that will protect your water quality. You need that. And it's they're not so complex that it should take a long time to do. They're kind of standard things.
Yeah. Lots of opportunities to engage, all of them important. And to me, the theme is we need elected officials to hear from average citizens like each of us that are, have passions and interests related to rivers and other interests, and they need to hear from us. They need to hear from us, because without it, these priorities fall off their radar. So I want to spend the next maybe 8 to 10 minutes talking a little bit about the challenge of protecting living rivers that transcend this particular political moment, and then get to maybe a half a dozen questions from the audience in the last 10 minutes. Obviously, the Clean Water Act rollbacks are discouraging and have real effects. And there's a bigger existential crisis for Western rivers, which is basically that they don't have rights to their own water. And obviously, a river that has no water can't have clean water. How do we deal with this sort of compounding crises that are overlaying one another? The Clean Water Act rollbacks, the climate crisis, the drought, and the absence of regulatory and legal mechanisms that protect living rivers. It's a tall order.
Absolutely. I think ultimately a big change needs to happen. I mean, if you think about the collision of crises, so you have unsustainable water use in the West, you have dams and diversions, you have climate change on top of all of that. I mean, those things are not something that were as extreme as they are now. And so now we're seeing the effects of all of those things, all of those ways in which we've maximized the beneficial use of water. Like, that's not sustainable. And it's not going to be sustainable, especially as flows decrease in rivers due to climate change. And so, I mean, we have to obviously stop climate change. We have to take significant actions in how we deal with climate change, so that the worst case scenario predictions for our Western rivers, which is like 20–40% of the Colorado River, between 25 and 50% of the Rio Grande River, those flows are just off the top gone because of climate change. If we don't stop climate change by reducing our reliance on fossil fuels and having a new economy that doesn't rely on them, like there's just crisis after crisis that's going to happen. I think ultimately we need to reform Western water law and policy, like fundamentally reform it, so that it's not a take all the water out of the rivers at all costs, rely on old compacts that were made in the 1920s and 30s when we thought we had unlimited amount of water, and start bringing those things into reality, where we amend the compacts, we change how much water, and make sure that those allocations between states are actually equitable, and that we reduce the amount of water that we use for irrigation, and that we reduce the amount of water that we use for municipalities. We can't just keep going back to our rivers over and over again, because they're too important to all life, not just people, but people and wildlife and ecosystems. And unless we protect all of those things, there's going to be a significant crisis on our hands that we're going to have to deal with.
Yeah, it's a sobering reality to grapple with, and we see it here in the Southwest, where dry summer, drier late winter, and our rivers are like ghosts relative to what we expect them to be. And with a dry winter ahead of us, it's quite worrying to see what we're facing.
Yeah, I mean, the Rio Grande is Exhibit A right now as to rivers in crisis. That, I mean, there's roughly 30, 40 miles of the Rio Grande in New Mexico right now that is dry. The irrigation district is diverting water down its canals to get it to Elephant Butte. And there was an article just recently in the Albuquerque Journal that said, like, we're so glad that we can, you know, not waste this water by putting it in the river channel. And so it's a whole mindset change that needs to happen around, we're not wasting water to put it in the river channel. That's where the water is supposed to be. And until rivers have a right to their own water, where it's at the same level and the same protection as an agricultural water right or a city's water right, like those special places that people go, the Bosque in Albuquerque, or, you know, a headwater stream in the Colorado River, are going to be dry. And it's going to be a really sad reality for my kids and their kids going forward.
Hard reckoning. Kelly, anything to add to this sort of more geographically focused and issue around how to not only ensure that we have clean water, but water in rivers?
So that's a tough one. I think that's a really complex issue that requires lots of different solutions coming together. I don't know if I can really add much to what Jen said. I would say that good things are still happening. There are still ways and laws and regulations available for states and citizens to use to advocate for these policy and outcomes. And so, educating people about what those are and talking about what the right solutions are to some of these problems is a really important thing that we can do, and also feel hope, I guess, about being able to withstand some of the losses that we're facing at the same time.
Yep. There are increments of sort of new ways of changing the paradigm to ensure that rivers do have rights to their own water, for sure. So, well, I'd like to get to some questions from participants. Here is one. There was an article, this is from Stephen Parrish. Thank you, Stephen. There was an article in the Denver Post from September 6th talking about the plan to build a reservoir near the Holy Cross Wilderness wetlands to supply water to Aurora and Colorado Springs. Is this something that you are aware of? Why don't you take that, Jen?
Yeah,
because Jen was quoted in that article.
Yeah, this is something that we're aware of. This was a project, a very similar project existed decades ago and was shut down. And this is the attempt again by the city of Colorado Springs and Aurora to divert water from the Colorado River to the West Slope. Right now, they're doing what's called a geotechnical investigation, which is basically drilling and doing all sorts of things to figure out if it's even feasible to do the project. We're waiting on a permit from the Forest Service to see whether that is, they're going to grant that permit to do those actions. This area, the Holy Cross Wilderness, has some of the most incredible wetlands and fens and just natural amazing structures that create clean water, and so it's a really, really valuable area. And so we intend to, we're working to build a coalition of folks. A lot of people were really angry about this, and there were like 700 plus comments on this particular special use permit. And so we're working with some of our allies to decide whether there's a challenge for this initial phase, and then we're obviously tracking it going forward to ensure that this project doesn't get built, quite frankly.
And is that a situation where the cities have actually legally acquired water? Is that what they're relying on?
They're trying to put their water, quote, quote, water rights to use. that they've had for a while. This project failed before because they tried to put a diversion structure in a wilderness area, and you can't do that. And so they're trying again many years later to do the similar thing. You know, they're trying to talk to people and collaborate, but the reality is they want to take more water out of the Colorado River and they want to ship it to the Front Range. And in so doing, they intend to basically drain and want to like try to re-engineer wetlands someplace else to make up for the loss, which I think is just asinine. I mean, wetlands are something that's just an immeasurable thing that you can't recreate as a human. So.
And would this diversion be from the Holy Cross Wilderness or just outside of it and then impact the Holy Cross Wilderness?
I haven't seen, I don't know exactly. I mean, I know that, I don't know exactly where the diversion is, but I think that I think there are 50 acres of the wilderness that actually would have to be inundated. So it will impact the wilderness. Wow. Whether the structure is in the wilderness or not.
Yeah. Okay, we'll stay tuned to that one. Lots more to be done in order to make sure that that development does not get built and those rivers on the Colorado River side be depleted. Here's another question that you could take, Kelly, from Patricia Flood. What's the difference between an ephemeral and an intermittent stream?
Depends on who you ask. Under this definition, it is a stream that only flows in response to rainfall or snowfall. That's how they define it. And intermittent being flows seasonally throughout the year, can be fed by rainfall and groundwater or snow melt, so that there's a sort of consistency, at least seasonally, to the flow. So that's how this rule makes those distinctions between the two.
And is that distinction in the rule consistent with what with the scientific consensus or not?
Exactly, no. And it's a little different. It's also different because of this concept of the typical year. So you can have an ephemeral stream that flows in response to groundwater, for example, or you can have an intermittent stream that flows in response to rainfall, only rainfall. So scientifically they're different terms, and also we don't look at them in this really complex modeling context of what is a typical year. No one knows what that means exactly.
Yeah.
Especially today, where things today look nothing like they did in the past. So yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So jurisdiction can kind of come and go over time, depending on what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a question in the absence of other questions from the audience around the EPA, which is the agency that's responsible for administering the Clean Water Act. What's your sense to both of you about morale within the EPA, and if we have a shift in federal administrations come next January, courtesy of everyone voting, what needs to be done to address what I imagine is very low morale within the EPA? You want to take that first, Kelly, and then you add to it as well, Jen?
Sure. Well, it's really important for me to stay away from electioneering. So I want to be careful about how I answer the question.
Well, let me say this. I'm merely asking you, if there were a new administration, how would a new administrator of the EPA embrace the challenge of restoring morale? That is the question. Nothing to do with the election.
Gotcha. Sorry, I would be in trouble if I didn't say that thing.
Yeah.
So, So I think that within the EPA, not that I've never worked there, but I've worked with them quite a bit. I think the things that restore morale are reinstating this sort of fundamental rules that inspire integrity and reliance on independent scientific opinion, which requires bringing people in that have that institutional knowledge about the way that the agency has historically worked to hopefully focus on protection of the public interest. It requires restoring transparency and decision making and access to records, and restoring the scientific advisory boards and other advisory councils that give input into the agencies that allow them to be making these scientific state-of-the-art movements forward to addressing things like unconventional pollutants, things like PFAs, where we need to actually be using the science to protect ourselves. I think that's a little bit of it. So having people in that understand the job, are committed to the mission, protecting the public interest, and then restoring some of these norms within the agencies and the scientific resources.
Jen, what would you add?
Yeah, I agree. I think that the return to a really intentionally science-based analysis around these things, I think that would, a lot of folks that work for the EPA are scientists, and they're really proud of what they bring to the table. And when those opinions are being disregarded, I think that it obviously would lower morale. So I think that returning to a really intentionally science-based decision-making model, I think also just a lot of folks are really passionate about doing, if you know what the Clean Water Act says, and what the mission of the Clean Water Act is a lot of folks, that's what they would like to do. And I think that we've deviated from that, and that it's probably really difficult when you're passionate about something to be required to do things that you maybe don't believe in.
Yeah. Yeah, I have never been inspired to want to work in a federal agency, but I've always been inspired by those who do work for federal agencies with integrity. Because, as advocates, we rely on those, as citizens, we rely on those people to uphold the public interest. And these are difficult times to be a civil servant whose job it is to do just that. So I think this is the importance of leadership. And we need leaders who will back frontline agency officials who are going to make hard decisions that protect the public interest, and that do so maybe at some expense to industry. And it's going to take a lot to restore the morale of some of these agencies. So I just want to say in closing that these are hard times, and not only for those of us who care about the natural world, they're hard times for our nation as well. And I think that taking critical small steps like supporting the Clean Water Act is one thing we can do. We want to vote for people who speak up with compassion for the natural world. And so I urge each and every one of you, if you haven't already, to vote for candidates who believe in science and the rule of law, and who act with care and kindness for all life forms. And I want to thank Kelly for joining us. Great to have you. Jen, thank you, not only for your presence here today, but for your work in taking on the Trump administration and on behalf of the Clean Water Act and Living Rivers. So, and thank you to all of our audience members as well. Lively discussion, and appreciate the participation on everyone's part. So.
you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kelly, for joining us today. It's been fun to have you.
All right, we'll see everyone soon. We have another webinar next week, and then of course an election in 13 days. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.